So, you join me in Sweden at a slightly different time and a slightly different recording method than I prepared. I honestly had got my microphone, had got my camera set up, and was preparing to record this in a very normal fashion. And then I found that my computer was really not liking it all. It really wasn't. And that reminded me of the Cossack video I did. So you might be getting a whole series of videos produced like this via phone camera and phone recording device. This could be highly intriguing for some of the premieres to come, but we will see. Though it depends. How many do I decide I really want to re-record? And as you can guess from the slides, I decided I wanted to re-record my second rates video. Why? Honestly, it's because second rates are an interesting thing to me. And they get a lot of flack. They do. They really do. And nothing can be said more than this. Second rate ships of the line were also three-deckers, but smaller and cheaper. They mounted between 90 and 98 guns, and like the first rates, fought in the centre of the line of battle. Generally around the 2,000-ton mark, they had a crew of about 750. Unlike the first rates, which were too valuable to risk in distant stations, the second rates often served overseas as flagships. They had a reputation for poor handling and slow sailing. Now this intrigued me. This intrigued me for several reasons. One, this is put up by the Royal Museums of Greenwich, and usually I have a fairly high estimation of them, but there are certain areas where I have found them interesting in the past. And when you make sweeping statements like this about an entire section of ships, that is a very big statement to make. Secondly, second rates have got a history because of being basically what's associated with the phraseology of second rate, of being treated rather badly. We've put a lot of lexicon on second rate being not as good as first rate. Interestingly enough, though, third rates never suffered the same. Why did they not? Well, they made up the majority of the fleets, so it's very difficult to say they are bad ships, because why are they making up the majority of fleets? And secondly, third rates never hold the same level as first rates and second rates. Second rates are always compared to first rates and found wanting, because first rates are the very best, biggest, most powerful ships you can build. They command the best designers, most attention, they command the most funds, the most crew, usually the highest trained crew, and usually have the most senior admirals in them and very senior captains and hand-picked officers and all these things, in which case they have all the advantages. They should be better than pretty much anything else out there. Whereas the second rate operates in a rather niche atmosphere. It is there as an enforcer, it is part of the heavy core of the fleet, but it is neither the mass of the third rate providing numbers and the fleet's overall firepower and strength, nor is it the epitome of firepower that is the first rate. It sits in the middle. It's the squidgy middle. And as such, it's often a difficult ship to define in purpose and even more difficult to define in role. Because whilst you can say, well, yes, it's a flagship of less important stations, but those stations also just as often end up with third rates as flagships instead of second rates. It's more a case of, is this important enough? Is the admiral senior enough? Does he want a three-decker to go out there? And that's the big advantage of a second rate and a first rate over a third rate. It has a third deck, so it can fire down on to a ship. It's the same as castles. Being able to fire down upon the enemy deck is an advantage. It's an advantage for when you close on board. It's an advantage for disabling their ability to control their engines, i.e. their sails. It's an advantage for your own accuracy. It's an advantage in many, many ways, which is why it's worthwhile. But there again, there are accounts of 4 of these ships bashing into each other in a battle. And people going, well, yes, this shows how bad the second rates are. These 4, let's leave aside the fact that in that battle there were some issues with command and control, and there were some issues with other ships bashing into each other, as well as the second rates. The 4 second rates in the core of the fleet managed to bash into each other and become an entangled mess. Now, the thing is, the problem for the second rates is when they have bad examples, they stick out far more than third rates because they can't hide in the mass. And unlike first rates, they are not always produced as one-offs. In fact, they're often produced as sort of loose classes or as actually expressed classes. In which case, when one ship gets a bad reputation, they all tend to. So this is this curious scenario you find the second rates in. They're in a high enough profile role that any failures are going to get magnified and discussed because they're important enough and rare enough that they are going to speak for their whole group when there's a problem. But they are also in a low enough role, they don't necessarily get the same level of attention and service and general support that their prominence should really require. That's a fun thing. So, Troubles, Battles and Darings. Why have I suddenly gone on to a book about destroyers? Well, it's shameless book plug time, so if you don't want to watch this, skip a couple of minutes ahead. And if you're like a gentleman who recently said he didn't want to hear about pensions and anything to do with me, definitely skip ahead, because this is the personal bit about me. You see, I'm a naval historian, I'm an academic, and academics in the UK are promoted, hired, everything on their ability to sell books, basically, and publish journal articles. Now, journal articles are a law unto themselves, and their circulation up to the journals. But books, well, I can promote those. So I do a shameless book plug in every single video, because I would like that permanent post. I would like the pension. I would like the stability that comes with that. It'd be nice. I'd also preferably like a post which allows me to keep doing all these YouTube videos, because I really like talking to all of you. I really like the fun naval history I get to do because of you. All my research, everything is funded thanks to you all now. And all this work, none of it would be possible without you. So thank you. Right then, so what was a second rate for? Well, basically a second rate is for thundering through gaps in the enemy's line. It is large enough it can fire down. If there is a hole, it can exploit it. It's slightly cheaper than a first rate, but not really by enough to really say it's the cheap vessel. That's the third rate. You produce those en masse. It's slightly less crew than a first rate, but again, not enough to really make yourselves happy. It's still also crew, about 700 to 800 versus 800 to 900. So honestly, that's not much of a saving. This ship is not about cheap. It's about force maximization. It's about having a heavy hitter to break the enemy line. The first rates will do this, but honestly, you're not going to have enough of those normally in any one fight because they're important. So they're going to need some ships which are going to widen that line out around them, or maybe charging ahead of them. It doesn't matter. What you need is something which can thunder in and break the line and then be reinforced by the third rates. And this is what second rates are. Put another way, if you were talking about your infantry squad, your third rate is your line infantry. Your first rate is probably your squad sergeant and your officers. Your second rates are your corporals. They are there to provide a core. They are there to provide leadership on a small level. They are there to provide morale. They are there to provide often specialisms. They're not there to take over from the sergeants. They're not there unless there's an actual emergency and the sergeant's gone. But they're there, and they're just as useful as the sergeant in a slightly different way. So yeah, in this battle, you can see the center Domingo exploding, and Rodney's flagship sword Sandwich is in the foreground. And Sandwich is actually a vessel which is going to show up a little bit in this discussion today. She is. Rodney liked her. Rodney, Admiral Rodney, the hard-charging admiral charging around the world, liked his second rate. That's a good thing. Now, why are you getting this done by a video phone? Why are you getting it done in this way? Well, as said, I'm in Sweden. I'm on Scandi Ship 24. And yeah, we have a crowdfunder going to support it. There should be a link down below if I've done my job right. And yeah, this is entirely paid for by you. So it's thanks to all of you that we're out here. It's thanks to all of you we're able to do naval history over here we're doing. And I hope you're enjoying it. But with that, let's get into the tech. So what does this show us about second rates? What does this slide show us about second rates? To be honest, it shows the Royal Navy built a lot of them. I could have put up the slide of first rates here built in a similar time period as comparison, but I didn't feel the need to. I'm going to be getting into those stats in another slide. But realistically, the Royal Navy built a lot of them. And the first is the Royal Catherine, HMS Royal Catherine. Now, she's interesting because she was here. She's the first second-rate ship built as a ship called the second rate. Now, I've discussed this already with the first rates, that realistically what happens is the ship's line expand up. And as they get bigger, these niches open up. And the really big niche is when you get a big difference between the ships which are your largest, most powerful ships and your core ships. Now, your core ships are 64, later 74, and later than that 80 guns. They're your third rates. Well, your first rates, they start off, and some of them are as little as 80 guns themselves. Some of them are even less than that. And then they grow up to be bigger and bigger and bigger, and they end up with hundreds of guns. And that leaves a gap. That leaves a gap which things like the Royal Catherine fill, although she's not always called the Royal Catherine, and this is where things become really interesting with second rates. She's rebuilt she starts life as an 84 gun ship. She's rebuilt as a 90 gun ship in 1702 and renamed HMS Ramleys in 1706. And she will actually end up as Admiral Byng's flagship. Yes, the ill-fated Admiral Byng. She's an interesting vessel, and she's followed by the Charles, the St. Michael, the Vanguard, the Duchess, the Sandwich, the Albemarle, the Duke, the Ossory, the Neptune, the Barfleur, Nemmer, and Triumph. And some of these ships, their names get reused again and again for second rates. Some of them get mixed around with names. Some of them have their names changed completely. And this makes following them kind of interesting. But also, one of the key things about them is they get rebuilt a lot, because HMS Royal Catherine is launched in 1664. She started in 1662, and yet she's wrecked in 1760. I kid you not, that vessel is on the books for nearly 100 years. Nearly 100 years. And when you start looking through some of the ships, well, HMS Charles is laid down in roughly 1666, some would say 1665, and she's launched in 1668 as a 96 gun ship, then rebuilt as a 90 gun ship, renamed HMS St. George in 1687, and is broken up in 1774. So theoretically serves for the Royal Navy for 106 years. I can tell you one thing, she went through a couple more than just one rebuild. And it goes through the list. So here's your problem, the first problem. If second rates are not useful, if they are these terrible ships which are not powerful enough, are not fast enough, are not capable enough, are not useful enough for the Royal Navy, why does the Royal Navy keep building them? Why, if these ships are so not good, does the Royal Navy keep building them? If they're not the cheap, easy production of the third rates, because they're not as cheap or easy to produce as the third rates, and they are so not as good as the first rates, why keep building them? If they are so bad sailors, if they are so bad ships to use, In what way does all these supposed negatives they have stacked up against them as a whole group, that the lovely people at Greenwich, no less, say that second rates had a reputation of poor handling and slow sailing, and were smaller, cheaper, all these things than first rates? Why are they still being built? Because let's be honest, in the period we're talking about, the late 1600s till the 1810s, the Royal Navy isn't exactly short of funds. They aren't exactly suffering the same issues they did historically. So why are they still building these ships? And I would agree, these ships are not fast. They're not, their length to beam ratio is screwed up a bit because they need a higher beam because of their higher height, because they're going to have 3 gun decks to support the height. You need the greater beam. But you don't have as many guns as the first rate, so you're not going to have the same length to beam ratio. Length to beam ratio improves handling, it improves sailing characteristics, improves fuel economy in modern ships. Length to beam ratio is one of those critical assets. But still, the Royal Navy has a lot of these ships. In 1794, the Royal Navy have 5 or 6 first rates operational. They have 9 of 19 second rates operational. In 1814, the Iron have 8 of 11 first rates operational and 7 of 14 second rates operational. And these are illustrations come from the Barfleur class. HMS Prince George is the lovely model, and HMS Princess Royal is the design. And this class was built by Slade. No less a designer than Slade himself. Doesn't produce a bad ship. And the interesting thing comes through once we start looking at these figures, how many they have operational, and when we consider their length of service. You start to get an idea that maybe second rates are the Royal Navy's answer to the conundrum of what happens if they lose? What happens if they lose? What happens if the French and Spanish manage to overwhelm Nelson's fleet at Trafalgar and then manage to somehow overwhelm the Channel Squadron and the various other squadrons they could pull in? What are they going to send out to fight them? What can they put together? Well, they have sitting around quite a lot of second rates, sitting in ordinary. And they can be commissioned. Can they be commissioned quickly? Relatively so. They're usually stored in ordinary with guns. They don't have powder loaded. They don't have various things loaded which they might have done, but those things are relatively easy to get on. Crew, well, again, there's an interesting thing about a second rate, whereas a first rate often gets a first rate crew. I'm using that appropriately. A second rate, you would be less fussed under those circumstances how many landlubbers end up on that ship versus experienced seamen. And then you can put a fleet to sea which is going to be a heavy fleet. It's going to be full of 3-deckers. So maybe what you need to think about the second rates as is not so much a fleet fighting unit, although they're very useful when they are put into the fight, but think of them as a fleet recreation unit. Should your fleets lose the battle, they're the quickest way of providing a large volume of firepower at sea. Something which can theoretically go toe-to-toe with a first rate and stand a chance, especially in enough numbers. And so you keep some in reserve. Because let's be honest, If you consider out of the first rates and second rates which weren't operational in 1814, yes, a couple of those are in refit, but the Royal Navy could probably have got 2 first rates out and at least 6 of the second rates out to form the core of any fleet should they need to rapidly put something together. And that's a heavy force. So therefore, the idea becomes that the second rate is the strategic insurance. And they're used to reinforce fleets where fleets need to be reinforced by that kind of firepower. And you don't want to activate another first rate because that does cost more money. What do I mean by that? Why does it only have so many first rates to go around? Well, if you consider in 1784, 5 or 6 operational. In 1814, 8 of 11. To activate more of those, you need to have more. If you want to have the same depth of ships with first rates as you do with second rates, you're talking about building 25 first rates. And having them on the books in 1794, you're talking about having, again, 25 first rates in 1814. You're talking about 25 ships. And again, when you consider what do they have available and operational, in 1794, they have 14 of those 25 ships operational. In 1814, they have 15 of those 25 ships operational. Notice a theme going on here? Yes, the Royal Navy has upped the number of first rates by 5 vessels. But they've only upped the operational ships by 1 overall. The interesting thing comes again when we consider what other navies are doing. You know, the Royal Navy here are using second rates as their enforcers, as their heavy units, as their, in case of emergency, activate, because they're going to make any crews into a capable force. Well, basically, the reason other navies tend to go with a 2-decker for a second rate, which is going to have a longer beam duration and be a better sailing vessel, is because they want that firepower, that level of strength, to try and bust through the Royal Navy and to try and make up for their own issues and insufficiencies. So the British want a 3-decker vessel because that's the ultimate fighting tool, but not necessarily the ultimate sailing tool. But if you're going to be defending Britain in a last-ditch effort, you want to activate second rates because with a 3rd deck, they're going to be firing down into enemy ships, and any enemy fleet which has made it that far has already fought through the rest of your navy. So let's be honest, they're not going to be in great condition. Even if they won those battles, they're not going to be in great condition. Whereas for the other navies, they're looking at it going, well, hang on, the Royal Navy's dominating the sea time, they're dominating the training, they're dominating all these things, therefore we need second rates to make up for that, to give us the firepower that hopefully can make up for our other disadvantages. And then we have the fact that the Royal Navy does like to use them for other things. In fact, HMS Union, at some point in the 1790s, is converted into a hospital ship, as you can see from these lovely drawings. This is her in her original form, and this is her, she's been adapted to a hospital ship. And there's actually studies which come from her. Now, there's a whole debate whether she's converted before 1794. So, technically, back here, HMS Union should potentially be black. But I think she's converted around about 1793. But I cannot prove that. The reason I say 1793 is some systems say 1796, but there are articles apparently from Experience aboard her from 1795, 1794. Takes a while to convert her, as you can see. They do remove all the cannon from these decks. So, yeah, this is an interesting one. And again, it's the joyous thing of really trying to track down the Royal Navy, because whilst we are dealing with an organisation which can be incredibly bureaucratic, and that is its saving grace, its organisation, bureaucracy, and ability to produce modern factory levels of production of components which are simple, straightforward components, like the systems used in their rigging, the block and tackle used in their rigging, that is mass produced. The rope is mass produced to a very good quality. They can also at some points be curiously vague. And that vagueness tends to work for them when it comes to spending of money. When they don't want to explain to Parliament exactly how much they're spending. One of the interesting things about this is, during this period, when these ships are getting great rebuilds and all sorts of things are happening, the Royal Navy also builds the Admiralty Arches and all the massive offices for itself. And go back and try and find a special votive of funding for that. And no one asks where they're getting the money from. So it's an interesting thing. And this means second rates as a whole are highly interesting. Because when we consider here again, this is the Battle of the Saints, and it's HMS Duke is moving in to break the line and engage two French ships. And this is often what second rates are used for in fights. When they're used for in fights, they can fire down, they can go through a line, they can break a line. That's what they're for. They're a sledgehammer. There's nothing delicate about it. And as we all know from having used a sledgehammer, and unfortunately I haven't got 4 or 5 here to illustrate as I did when I first used this line in a recorded video, a sledgehammer is a great weapon, a great system. It's great for doing what it needs to do, which is hitting something hard. But you can't control it as finely as you can a 16, 18 ounce or 24 ounce hammer, a one-handed hammer that you can refine, etc. No, a sledgehammer is a big thing you bring down, or you bring across. You'd use it two-handed. It's like a sword, a long sword in that regard, but it's not as finely balanced. All the weight is at the end. It is designed to crash into something with force. But it takes quite a lot of force to control it. The same is true for a second rate. And this is because of their length to beam issue, but it's also because of, honestly, often their crewing issues. Third rates often have very long sea service and long commissions and ongoing commissions, and lots of people have experience of handling third rates. So they're fine. You know, that all compensates for that and gives them good characteristics. First rates get the finest admirals as a rule, who pick the finest captains, who accrue the finest crew. Usually the highest proportion you will find of experienced sailors will be on first rates. And again, they'll often be on stations and duties for a long time. Second rates, which tend to be activated when they're needed, in a hurry and charged out, don't get that. And let's be honest, half a ship's sailing characteristics are down to how the crew handle the rigging, how capable and experienced they are. And yes, the British operate on a simplified rigging versus the French model, but that's not going to make things infinitely easy straight away. Now, the really interesting thing for me with second rates is when I was thinking them through, and I was thinking through the various options in the age of sail and different nations approached them, there was one navy that really struck out for me. You see, the US Navy, when they're building their ships aligned, they go straight for first rates. That's what they're trying to build, not third rates. But realistically, what they needed was second rates. What they should have been looking at were second rates. Now, there's a debate you can get into as whether they need to have 2-decker second rates or 3-decker second rates. I would argue for what the US Navy expected them for, a largely heavily armed defensive fleet, then probably a 3-decker would be their better option. It would mean they would have a height advantage against any third rate, and pretty much for the Royal Navy they'd have to send across their fleet of first rates and second rates if they wanted to engage it. That's the point. If you have a fleet of second rates, then that automatically means I'm going to need to send something more or a lot of third rates to win this fight. By concentrating on the first rates, the US Navy and the US Congress succeeds in making it more difficult for themselves to produce and more complicated for them to crew, etc., by setting themselves such a high standard to achieve, and therefore they don't really get them into service. But there again, they couldn't pick a second rate because it's neither fish nor fowl. It's not the greatest ship you have on your books, the first rates, and it's not going to give you the mass, the quantity that is a quality all of its own of the third rates. If you think of a fleet as concrete, as a concrete wall, the third rates are of course the concrete. The first rates, they're the primary beams and footings going in that really solidify the fleet. But the second rates, they're the rebar. They're the bars going across all through it that tie it together. They don't get as much attention. As you know, we always talk about the mix of the concrete and how it's going to be mixed, how it's going to be formed, what kind of ratios we're going to use. We talk about the critical beams, the primary beams, their footings, how they're going to be arranged. But honestly, the rebar, that's treated as just, we'll do that. It's a necessary fundamental component that adds greatly to the capabilities and strength and stability of that wall, but it's really not thought about much. And that's a second rate, truly. So, there you go. That's probably a bit shorter than I normally do these, but I am doing it recording via phone. And if the sound and volume has changed during it, well, I had a bit of an idea halfway through. We'll see how it works out. Please comment whether the sound was better towards the end or at the beginning, and I'll know for the future. I'm not going though without a question. I always finish these videos with a question, and this is not going to change now. Now I was tempted to put in a question of, what do you think happens if the US Navy goes for second rates rather than first rates? Da, 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 da. But I decided not to, because let's be honest, sometimes alternate history questions are interesting points of strategic divergence and discussion. Sometimes they're just pointless because there's no scenario where US Congress is going to go for anything but the very, very best when they're ordering it and then complain about the cost the moment they've ordered it. No. The question is this. The Royal Navy stick with 3-decker second rates because of the defensive firepower advantage, the fighting advantage it gives them, the height. If they go with the 2-decker version, still trying to go for 96 guns, but across 2 decks, what do you think that has in terms of effect on the rest of the Royal Navy's construction? Does it mean their first rates have to get bigger? After all, they're still triple decks. Does it affect the second rates? Because let's be honest, if you're dealing with 96 gun 2-deckers in your second rates, how's that going to affect your third rates? What are they going to be looking like? What are they going to be acting like? Are they still going to be 74s, or are you going to go, well, actually, no, that's not really useful anymore, you know? Or are you going to go for 80s, or are you going to go for 64s, or are you going to stick with 74s? What do you think would happen? Because the major advantage, and I've sort of tried to point this out several times, if you consider these ships versus a two-decker, is this row of guns, which might not be big. Let's be honest, they have a habit of not being that big. They're often 12-pounders. It often goes 32, 18, 12s. If they're not that big, well then, how are they still useful? It's clearing decks. It's allowing for boarding action. It's stopping the enemy being able to control their ship. So that's useful, but would it be as useful as maybe having a longer two-decker, two-gun deck ship which has 18s and 24s on those decks? Because it can afford to, because it doesn't have them as high up, because it isn't dealing with the metacentric height, because it isn't dealing with having to have all this beaming at this framework to support the weight of having 3 gun decks and the height it brings in. It's a longer length to beam ratio, so it's going to be a faster, more agile ship, but it's not going to have the fighting advantage of the height. So that's the question. What do you think changes about history if the Royal Navy concentrates on two-decker second rates rather than three-decker second rates? What have we got coming up? Well, this will have come out in the week of the conceptual operation conclusion of HMS Unicorn. Honestly, not a carrier, more a shore bombardment vessel. I enjoyed writing that. And next week is going to be the war emergency ships. And then it's going to be the Bow Guerrilla Attack class. And both of those, I have to admit, are up for re-recording. Both of those are up for re-recording. It's tempting. I'm not sure if they're necessarily the right dates listed there. I think those are the Tuesdays. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you found it helpful. And yeah, this is different from the video I originally recorded, but I think it's better. It's less of a this class, and more of an overview of the second rates. And I'm probably going to do some classes of the second rates as their own key ships, because they deserve it. Mainly in this video, I have to admit, I was trying to avoid ranting because I was worried I could end up doing so. Because I find it annoying when people speak in big sweeping statements about whole groups of ships. Because there's a lot of specifics, a lot of context and nuance around it. And these ships, I would argue, have a high point of utility. But at a certain point, the first rates are starting to really get more useful. And the Royal Navy has more of them. But they still have roughly 25 of these large ships. Roughly 25 in service to provide that core of the fleet. All right. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.